Okay, if we could have all the mics turned on. We have just under an hour, and I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists to try and dig deeper into some of the key themes we wanted to expose in this session, and then we'll have a half an hour for questions from the audience, so please have your questions ready. I just want to begin, do you folks think there's a difference between science that's a public controversy and just straight science communication? If there was a colleague in the audience engaging in science communication, they see it starting to turn into a public controversy, should they shift tactics? Is there something different, or is it merely the amplification of the issues in the prior?
Everybody seems to be looking at me, but
You were first.
I guess I was first. So I think, here's the social scientist answer in me. It depends, right? I think there are some cases in which, yes, we can think of this as kind of a similar way. The strategies, the empirical evidence pilot testing, for example, that's a great way to collect empirical evidence about how you might communicate something, even if it's about public controversy, right? I think one of the differences is maybe then thinking about your audiences as less uniform or homogeneous.
But something I heard in your talk, you talked about perceived social consensus. And that social consensus in a public controversy will come out from your tribe. So to take a position on science, do they sometimes have to take a position against their tribe's very public position to the contrary?
Yeah, and I think this gets to sort of the idea of credibility too, right? If you're taking a position against what is expected of you, people often assign more credibility to a source as well. So I think in that case, that might even help, communication.
Sure.
I think identity politics plays a big part in this. Think about the number of times you see or hear, you can't call yourself a good blank if you believe blank. You can't call yourself a good Christian if you believe in evolution, for example. It's really hard to get through that, for sure.
And so what's the nugget here? In a public controversy, you're getting down to core values and beliefs, which was in the initial report, but also those of the community with which you associate.
You are, and understanding that we don't have the public, we have multiple publics. One of the things we're not particularly good at as science communicators is the kind of market segmentation that advertisers engage in. There are different audiences. We need to understand where they're coming from. We need to understand why some misinformation or some controversial information resonates with them. What are the mental models that they have that this fits with? What are the metaphors that they're using? Unless we understand that, it's really difficult to address this kind of controversial information.
But let's go with that. So it almost sounds like we have to engage in a political campaign. There's the group that is with us, there's the group that's against us, there's the swing group. Are we actually going to do communication in that kind of a style?
All communication is political to a certain extent. The question is whether you're taking a particular position. And, again, it's not us versus them. It's not people with halos and people with horns. It's a question of what is it that we're able to do as experts based on what we know to actually help people help themselves. So it's not necessarily trying to get people to see things our way, it's giving or helping them understand information that's going to be useful to them.
Catherine?
So if I could add a point, within our crisis and emergency risk communication tool that I talked about, one of the very first things is to make an empathy statement. But you can't make that empathy statement if you don't know what the audience is feeling. So you have to understand that community in which particular audience. The second piece is to acknowledge the uncertainty and say, we don't have all the answers, but what we know now is. The next step after that, and here's what we're doing to find out the answers to the other questions. That's very hard to do. And it can also be very attractive to someone who's desperate for information to have somebody else going, I know all the answers right over here. And that person or group or website tends to get a lot of attention because they're not acknowledging the certainty. But over time, I think we build up trust, as you mentioned, when we acknowledge that we don't know everything.
So just to tie into that, I would add, that part of the approach is to connect with shared values around a problem. So we can agree that this is a particular problem that is worth solving, or this is a particular threat that's worth taking seriously. Here's what we know about that particular problem. Now, here's what we don't know. Here's why that's important. Here's why what we don't know is important. Here's what we're doing to try to become more certain, to resolve those particular issues. But based on what we know now, our best advice is to do this thing. But stay tuned, because we're continuing to do the research to become more certain. And as that information becomes available, our advice may change slightly.
But I heard a tension between Catherine, Bill, and Carol. Catherine, you brought in the idea of information terrorists. They're out there. Bill, you said people don't really want to know the science, they just want to know the conclusion. And Carol, you said people don't know the background science, but at the end of the day, if we're going to have a reasoned conversation, we have to get to the basis for our arguments, which is the background science, which they don't want to know. The pseudoscience is very sexy and compelling. How do you talk over the din?
Well, I think there's some movement toward helping scientists become better communicators with consumers. I know we have for our graduate students at Rutgers a big science communication program that I think has really helped a lot. And we've got to start growing our own media savvy scientists who have these great communication skills that go along with their really wonderful scientific knowledge so that they can be better instructors. And I think other universities are doing this as well. NIH is really pushing this and can be very helpful for students and science in general.
Okay.
If I can add too, I think those programs are really important, and my request to all of you to be more involved in social media, because more than half of people are getting almost all their news through their phone, not even on a computer screen anymore, through their phone. So if we are not there right up front, we're going to lose the argument until it's so far down the road that we're playing defense constantly.
Is an important factor in a public controversy the involvement of powerful economic and political interests? And the slide in the last presentation, the amount of money that just Coca-Cola, Philip Morris, and who was the third one? I forget, but
McDonald's.
there's a heck of a lot of money out there to try and protect their source of money. How do you weigh that into this battle? Are we the Boy Scouts going against the Marines? I mean, how do we fight that fight?
Well, you know, I think about our science communication and what we do. That's not our number one job. We have other things that we're doing. So there are some people who are rising up to make that their job. I'm thinking about SciBabe and Bill Nye and Science Babe that are really out there going head on. So if more people, I think more scientists might take that on as their career, it would be very helpful to have more of those voices out there because then they have a monetary gain as well. They have time to do this.
And so then they leave the confines of the academy. They now become advocates. Have they given up? Can you do that and be a legitimate scientist or professor? Maybe I take away that we're legitimate, but
I think you can. I just think there's not enough hours in the day.
I think it also bears reinforcing this idea that we talk about these sort of vested interests in communication, but the one thing we can learn from that is that they're very clear about that communication. There's a lot of goals. They know their audience, right? And that, I think, even with the limited resources that maybe we have if we want to think about it as sides, which, again, you know, we've pointed out that that's problematic, but we can learn that having this kind of strategic messaging that has a goal in mind, right? A very clear goal, a way to evaluate that goal, right? Knowing your audience. These are things that we can learn from successful campaigns run by vested interests.
But Bill brought up the idea that a lot of misinformation out there is designed to inflame, to polarize. Catherine brought up the idea that the media bias. And when I looked at that chart, I wondered, in public controversies, do the tails, the more extreme voices become amplified and therefore make it even more difficult to be in the middle? Who wants to listen to the middle broker when you've got some really loud voices that are speaking my music? And so how do we enter a debate when the interests are designed? And to repeat my question earlier, do we call out lies?
I think we have to call out lies, and I think as tenured members of the faculty, we're in a unique position to be able to call liars liars.
So you can't call
Well, I
people
can't
names.
call anybody a liar, apparently, but I will soon.
We'll see
Hopefully.
about that, yes.
Yes.
This is tricky territory. Others, can we do that?
I can only speak for that. I think the importance is to find out through the research. You can say right now something's not true, therefore that person is lying. If they 100% believe what they're saying, it's not an intentional lie, right? They really are trying to do something and accomplish something. And that audience research that I think all of us spoke about is the really important thing. If someone's saying it because they know it's not true and they're trying to get, money for your clicks, that's a little different to me than someone who is impassioned and incorrect. And even someone who maybe just out for themselves, it looks like, still may really believe what they're telling themselves.
So you're saying avoid lie, avoid
I
the word
think
lie.
it's more important to know and understand the research. And listen, it's so much easier to do audience research these days. I keep putting us to the internet, but we do message testing with A/B testing where you're just changing out a picture, or you're just changing out a caption, and immediately you can see the results of where people go. And sometimes it's different people go to different places. All of that kind of research tells you what audiences want, and then when they get there, you can give them what they need.
Okay. Social media, we're in a totally different world with social media. How much does that feed into public controversy? Would we have some of the public controversies we have right now if media didn't allow certain positions to be articulated and certain communities to form around them? Am I answering my question for
Yeah,
myself?
I think so. Because I think the flat Earth conspiracy theorists is a really good example where this was always kind of a small movement, but in recent years they've become much bigger because of YouTube, right? They have conferences right now that are 200, 300 people strong, right? Which is small for us, but we're 150 here, so.
Can it be tamed? Can social media be tamed?
I don't think it can be tamed in the way maybe that we would like it, where everything on there is true and research-based. Is the nature of what it is. We have to be there. Walter Cronkite, at the height of his CBS reporting, had somewhere between 25 to 27 million viewers for his show, which was when there was only 3 channels. Kim Kardashian has 60 million Twitter followers who follow what she tweets round the clock. She has more power to tell people something they need to know than Walter Cronkite had. If you look at that, that's what social media gives you. So when people are responsibly putting information out, that is, they're putting information out they either know to be true or they feel can help people, it can be incredibly powerful. We shouldn't try to tame that part.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to turn it to the audience so if we can have the mics ready and have your questions ready. But there's one more dimension I want to bring into public controversy, and that is that we're human beings. We have feelings. We get into the fight, and we encounter open hostility. I have a folder for hate mail. I get it because I write about climate change.
What's
How
your
do-
email address?
How do we factor that into our role as science communicators? How does that influence us? And how do we keep balance in that without just sort of getting totally overwhelmed and saying, screw it, I'm out of here?
Well, I don't have hate mail yet. I think I haven't been doing this long enough to get
Okay.
hate mail, but maybe after this, like Bill says, I might get hate mail. But I do want to point to, so there's great research in science communication about incivility as well and how that changes perceptions of sciences, right? And I think we're starting to kind of grow research in that area, so there's things we can learn from research there. But much like your question about how we kind of wrangle social media, some of this is going to be empirical evidence that helps us with that. But some of these are like the last panel said, social value questions that science can't necessarily answer for us.
But one thing social media can do, it can form a mob. And mob psychology, we lose our civility, we lose our values because we're anonymous, and we think we're part of a large group that thinks the same way, and we'll do and say things we would never do to someone in person. And when you're on the other end of that, can you really fight a mob?
Can you fight a mob by yourself?
No.
No, you can't. But you have to understand the dynamics of that.
Yeah.
And in this business, you can't necessarily take things personally.
Yeah.
It comes with the territory, and if you're going to be a responsible scientist and you're going to express the truth, then you have to expect people who don't want to hear the truth to respond negatively to you.
But I think it's also interesting to explore with them why they don't think it's the
Exactly.
truth, because then you can understand perhaps where they're coming from. And maybe what you're providing isn't what they need, and you can engage in a dialogue.
Yes.
Now, that's not true necessarily for the internet trolls that are just having fun berating whomever it might happen to be. And we have seen a rise in that. But for people who clearly don't understand, for example, we're doing some pilot testing of messaging with moms of school-age kids. And this was a sequel to a study that we did with preschool moms. In that time period between the two, sugar has become the major villain. So things that we could say 5 years ago about sugar, and the way we said it to these moms who now have older kids, not necessarily the same moms, but the same demographic, we can't say it in the same way. So times change, and we've got some competing forces out there that we need to be aware of, even if we're not fighting the social media, so to speak. We need to know what they're saying and how they're saying it, because that affects what we're going to say, because we need to be credible in what we're saying. Related to the topics that people are now so concerned about. Sugar will die off and it'll be fat again, or whatever nutrient is in trouble that the media picks on. But we have to be aware of what that's all about and how that translates into this filter that parents are using, or whoever the audience is, to understand this accurate information and why they might reject it.
So I agree, and I'll put my psychologist hat on, getting to what is the underlying concern. I hear you're angry, sort of where is this anger coming from? What is it that you're really concerned about? Often people aren't very good at understanding themselves what it is that they're really concerned about. So if you have the ability to sort of tease that out, then you can address this underlying issue and perhaps do it for more than one person. Good luck.
I don't mean this as a total snide remark, but it almost sounds like to be a science communicator, you have to be part therapist.
You need to be part social scientist, I think.
yeah.
You need to be part psychologist, part sociologist, part anthropologist.
Okay, let's add those to the list of courses doctoral
Yeah,
students have to
exactly.
take.
Exactly.
Okay, let's turn to the audience. Are there any questions out there? You have one already? Please say who you are and then ask the question.
Hi, I'm Kari Fisher. I'm with the New York Academy of Sciences. So my question is in regards to the statistic that over 60% of people are getting their news on social media. I think within that same Pew study, or a similar Pew study, it says also that 57% of people feel that the news that they see on social media is actually largely inaccurate.
Inaccurate.
So people are clearly getting more savvy and maybe a little bit nihilistic. So are we overemphasizing social media actually as our battleground?
Good question.
Well, I think the research says that we have an affinity for people who think the same way we do. So whether they're saying they're skeptical about it is one thing. Are they still believing it and following it? Or is there a kernel of truth or misinformation that they're following? So I'd like to see what they're saying in terms of how much of it they're actually using it. So that's the next step.
And I love that. I think it's a great first step to be a little skeptical.
Yes.
Right. So one of the earlier presentations talked about science literacy, and I talk about media literacy the same way. You should be looking at, media across the spectrum in a critical way. Evaluate it for yourself. But I have a 14-year-old who is completely convinced that he can tell what is real and what isn't. And he knows a lot of it's not real, but he knows when he reads something. I think that we tend to overemphasize our own ability or overestimate our own ability to tell what's real and what's not.
But isn't it helpful that he recognizes that's a skill that he needs to be able to have the bullshit detector?
Yeah, but he thinks he was born with it.
Okay, I'm totally blind by these lights. I think Holly is back there with a mic. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sikon Akman. I work for PBS NewsHour. I was wondering how many people in the room are newsmakers or work for news outlets? Is it just like, I was wondering if you had any tips for us based on your individual perspectives. I mean, I think, is there one thing that really grinds your gears about how newsmakers put out information that you think we should change, and do you have a tip for how to change it?
I would love to actually, it's more of a question. I understand that newsmakers, news writers need to tell both sides of the story. I've sort of talked about how important that is. But I do think that sometimes readers or viewers come away with an impression that it's a 50-50 issue because you have to put in that other side. And I wish I understood more about how the process happens within the newsroom or within the article about how do you acknowledge that there's a small percentage of people who still believe X without reinforcing that the way we learned in the earlier panel. Every time you repeat the myth, you reinforce it for the people. So I don't know what kinds of discussions or decisions are held, and I would love to understand that better.
But I also think news media has a different job than we do. We're promoting health, promoting a behavior that we know is going to be helpful. News media's job, and tell me if I'm wrong, is to report what the facts are, right?
Yes, yes.
Explain the difference.
Well, I'm talking about, though, when every time there's a story about vaccines, there's always a piece in there about some people believe, that the proportion of people who actually believe that is so tiny, but it's always there. And at what point do they become the 200 or 300 people of the Flat Earth Society where you don't need to mention that anymore? I don't know. I do completely understand that there's a different goal, but it's something that I just have never really understood. What's the best way to help reporters who are also trying to do exactly the right thing by giving people information they want and need?
And I think deciding on what that goal is, right? Kind of distinguishing the goal of, are we providing information or are we persuading? Because and sometimes that line is not very clear. So I think that would be one thing.
Okay, we have another question over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for those wonderful insights. My name is Faniel Wendy. I am from the STEM Advocacy Institute and Harvard in Boston. So my question revolves this point about the p-value fixation. I was wondering if any of the panelists can talk more about the role of p-value or fixation with the p-value, especially with scientists, and maybe the lack thereof understanding from the public. How does that play into the communication of science?
So the question really is about what qualifies as statistically significant versus practically significant. I think fundamentally that comes down to that. There is the replication crisis. The National Academies actually had several days on this particular issue. There are several pieces to this, of course. We need to be teaching our students better ways of figuring out effect sizes, for example, rather than simply relying on statistical significance. We need to teach them the dangers of p-hacking, essentially, looking for statistically significant relationships where none exist. It leads to publication biases. I mean, there are lots of different ways that we can deal with this. It's a genuine problem. There are ways to deal with it. And National Academies is trying to figure out how to help in that way.
And there's a tension, I think, that is more systemic, right? So like Bill alluded to, we have to try to teach our students this, that we caution them against that, but at the same time, publication is the currency of academia.
Right.
And so there's a tension, right, in like, do you want a job, right?
Right.
Do you want to get tenure?
But we can do pre-registration.
Yep.
I mean, there are lots of different ways to deal with that.
But we can also put it in context for people
Yes.
too. What does this really mean? Like the hedging example that I use, this is a mouse study. Or this was significant in the lab, but we need to do more studies to see if it's really going to hold up. And this was only this group of people. So I think we could do more, and I think the news services could help us a lot in that area. talking about the limitations of what this one study means and trying to put in a little bit more perspective and context of what the rest of the science says. And then that way we're not running with the results of one study and flushing our germ pills, as Mike McCrae referred to them in that particular article. So while news services, their job isn't to promote a particular health behavior, they can put things in context.
Okay. Question up here.
Hi, Christy Oshwan, and I'm a journalist. And I wanted to really quickly address this idea of both sides. I think that that does happen. That's not something that most journalists feel is required. So I just wanted to correct that, and particularly on things with like vaccines and climate change. I think that most journalism organizations now will not require. I mean, if the facts don't have both sides, then it may be important to mention just in the context of the social stuff, but not in a scientific way. But my question is really about something that I feel like hasn't been addressed too much yet, that it seems important, is how uncertainty is conveyed to the public. And this is something I've thought a lot about and written a lot about. I actually wrote a story for 538 a couple of years ago now. The headline was something like, "There's no such thing as sound science," but it was about sort of how vested interests use the concept of sound science to basically exploiting uncertainty and the public's misunderstanding that science is a process, it's not an answer. And we were talking here in this panel about nutrition science, but one of the problems here and one of the issues of why there's so much bouncing back and forth is that most nutrition studies are of very low quality and very low rigor. And it's not that they're bad scientists, it's a very difficult problem. And I think Vish actually alluded to this earlier, that the public has sort of a misperception about, the power of diet to change their lives, or to, this notion that there's a food that you can eat that will cure cancer or prevent cancer. That's not, we don't have science to show that, and yet that's what the public is thinking, and so that makes them vulnerable to this stuff. So I guess my question is really about, are any of you doing research or thinking about like how to convey uncertainty to the public? Because from my perspective, it seems like so many of these problems stem from the public not understanding that uncertainty is inherent in science, that this is a feature of it. It's not a sign that the science is bad, and that it's sort of an iterative process. And I think that the story that Brendan told earlier about what happened with his study is sort of an example of this. It's like, oh, we have a study and now we know everything, and this is said and this is the truth. And so as long as the public thinks that science is this magic wand that turns everything it touches into truth, we're going to be vulnerable to this idea that the latest thing is the last word, and that also sort of undermines the credibility of science in the public's mind, because then every time an idea is overturned, it's not seen as science working as it should, but a sign that science is broken or it's not reliable.
So is there a question?
Well, the question around conveying uncertainty, which means something very different in the scientific community and the public eye. And we could talk about other places where terms and ideas don't translate well. And when you've got an audience who thinks that science always has the answer, when we show any kind of weakness, are we hurting ourselves?
So let me combine that with the earlier question from our colleague from PBS. So one on my wish list is helping. What do we mean by science communication? What does it mean to be scientifically literate? It's not just knowing the facts. It's understanding how science proceeds. And we don't do a good job of appending to our stories what's likely to happen next. So here's this study. Let's put that into context. Here's what we thought before. Here's how this may be different, how it may move the science. But here's what's going to happen after that. There are going to be more studies on this. So again, here's what we know now. Here's what we don't know. Here's why that's important. Here's what's happening to resolve that uncertainty. Based on what we know now, here's what makes sense. Stay tuned.
Would that compel an audience to say, okay, now I'm going to change my lifestyle based on an answer like that?
I'm not trying to get you to change your particular lifestyle.
So you're not trying to persuade?
No, what I'm suggesting is that if we are able to convey that often enough, repeat it often enough, that we can help people understand how science proceeds, rather than simply focusing on the latest, episodic, outcome.
You were going to jump in?
I was just going to say, yes, during an emergency, that is exactly what we do. And then you have to do it regularly, and you have to fulfill that promise of going back with the new information when you have it.
I think this goes to a core question that Roger Pielke brought up in his book, The Honest Broker, is what is our role
Right.
in policy debates? And he got quite a lot of flack for differentiating between an issue advocate and an honest broker. The issue advocate narrows the available information, feeds it to the public. The honest broker just gives the public everything. And a lot of people took umbrage with that differentiation. But I think you're saying let the public decide, let the political process work out. Don't filter the information.
So can I just add, so this is Tiffany from AAAS. So I hear you all talking around something that I think should be clearly stated, which is that scientists and their institutions have a responsibility to make that clear and to be good communicators, to be reflective about what it is that they've done, and to talk about the process. I actually think that that's something that we can put on scientists and their institutions as a way to improve public communication.
Can we do that in the world of Twitter? Yeah?
I mean, I think we all have a responsibility kind of to do that, right? So scientists and institutions, but also media. We have, there's a reason why we all think that publics maybe think that some sciences about nutrition are solid, maybe because of the way they're presented as well, right?
But you're going to try and put out an idea, a result, and you're going to say, now, before you consume this result, let me explain the methodology. Let me go through a science lesson on what uncertainty actually means. Let's start to explain p-values.
Well, you don't need the whole lesson, but maybe you need a headline that is less, this is it.
Yeah.
So no one's suggesting that we need to be giving people science lessons. As I said in my talk, people don't really want to sit still for that. But I think because most people get the majority of their information about science still actually through mainstream media, which is retweeted or sent on Facebook, that it is possible to include pieces in mainstream media about how science works and appending pieces to articles that may still have the same headline, but give an indication of what's going to happen next.
Nodding heads behind you, we agree. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the bandwidth most people have when it comes to all the studies, all the information that they're being barraged with, and how we get them to follow through to that caution piece at the end of the article. So I think that's where some of this shorthand comes in, but if we can somehow keep them reading and keep them staying on our podcast or whatever it happens to be, we can get to that point. But to condense down the message that we want and to give all the cautionary pieces, it's a real challenge for communicators and to get people to stay with you.
And I take my role as moderator very seriously to be a provocateur. So to take this to the extreme, we're not going to act on climate change until we convince a majority of Americans how climate science works, what the models do, what the data is out there. That makes me feel very pessimistic.
So you're misinterpreting, I think, what we're saying.
Okay.
You're providing misinformation. It is being recorded right now. Again, you have a box of hate mail. No, I think we're not suggesting that we need to give people lessons in this, but we need to remind them perhaps of what they may already know. And so let's not be too provocative.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. We have a question over here.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Hi. My name is Alex Schiffman. I'm the producer of a science and comedy show in LA called Science, the Show.
Clever
so
title.
someone brought up influencers and people like Kim Kardashian. And I had a question I'm curious about. Do you guys think that it would be useful to try to target people like that towards being more on the side of science and science communication, or would that then still create some of the problems we have of too much authority being in anyone's opinion or views?
So I brought up the statistics, so I'll start and let everyone, I think all of us are influencers. Some are just more influencers than others. So a well-informed influencer can decide what they want to be a part of. It's always a shame to me when, inadvertently or not, one of those influencers shares information that is not helpful or that might create questions in minds of the public. But when they're aligned and we're together as a team, science, entertainment, personalities, other a sports figure, whatever, all saying the same thing, that's the most powerful thing for an individual who really doesn't know how to make that decision. So I would love to see more partnerships, like the festival we saw earlier, when people from different spheres come together. It can be incredibly powerful.
So I think I'm going to combine this with a question earlier about, are we overemphasizing social media? Because to bring in influences in here, I don't actually think we're overemphasizing social media, because this is how a lot of information gets shared now, right? Even if it's just information on regular media, even mainstream media now, mostly online, shared online, you just mentioned that. So I actually don't think we're overemphasizing social media, probably because of the networks and the networks of influences. And to answer your question, I think this is an exercise in triangulation, right? The more kind of people we can get to be about science, right? I think the better off we'll be.
My name is Modesta Bugo. I'm from University of Florida. So
Speak
my
up,
question.
speak up, please.
Okay.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Modesta Bugo. I'm from University of Florida. So my question is there a difference between communicating to address misconception and communicating to influence policy change? Because my experience, I've been doing a lot of communication work on GMOs in Nigeria, and from my experience, the people that we are talking to on social media, we don't have a way of tracking how much of these misconceptions that we are correcting. But then when we want to influence policy, we don't see those people on social media, like the grassroots, these powerful influencers that can help create a policy change. So my question is there a difference between those two things? And are there different strategies that can be used to help, let's say, achieve what you want as per the public understanding science and also influencing policy change? I could also liken it to what happened with Trump and climate change and communication around all of these things. So yeah, that's what I want to know.
I think to some extent that's a little bit of an empirical question, right? Is it different how I communicate to one audience versus the other? That kind of depends on what I know about the audience and what my goals are for that audience, right? Whether that audience is a policymaking audience or a public audience. And I think the challenge with trying to think about how we communicate with policymakers is that often policymakers are quite hard to study, right?
But with the public, it's more than just being the public. Do they have a self-interest? Is this part of their self-identity? Or is it something they don't know that much about, and you get them early on and could get them the accurate information before they might have.
Right, and knowing your publics, then I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we've done that a number of times in this talk of the media. We've heard that a number of times, but your media bias chart shows us there's very different constellations of media. There's very different publics. There's even very different academics or scientists. And we need to be cognizant of the differences. Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Heather Goldstone. I host a radio show called Living Lab Radio, and I kind of want to go back to the little bit of debate that broke out here about do we need to be giving science lessons when we talk about an individual study, and be provocative in perhaps a different direction, which is to say, I would say, yes, if we're going to talk in the news media about an individual study, yes, absolutely, we do have to talk about uncertainty, we do have to talk about methodology, we do have to talk about limitations, we do have to talk about context. My provocative question is, if that's all so daunting, why are we still trying to talk about individual studies when we, as a scientific community, recognize that that's kind of in and of itself the problem? And that's the distortion, right? That we're trying to talk about an individual study when that's not representative of our body of knowledge. So why are we still pursuing and banging our heads against that model as opposed to trying to think about a different way to present science to the public that isn't so focused on single studies?
I guess it depends on what your publication or radio station or whatever it happens to be your goal is. Is it to report the news, or is it to report about science, like Discover Magazine, for example, where they really can put it in context? So what's the motivation of the media source? Because if it's to sell newspapers or whatever, it's very different. But that doesn't mean that you can't bring in the overall concepts that have been found related to that particular finding. This runs in contrast with previous findings, or this supports what we already know. So that option is available too.
I would argue that the publication of a study is an artificial news story. It happens to be the day that a study was published. It's not the day-to-day information was found. It's not the day that it becomes relevant. It's artificial.
But you know, it's interesting. I've talked to editors, and they talk about one of the challenges with climate change is finding the new story, the new hook. And if you're only going to talk about the state of the science, it moves very, very slowly. But if you have one story that comes out, you know, the ice sheet is melting, a glacier is about to break, now I've got my hook, and now I'm going to write about it. So if to argue with you, to just give the state of the knowledge, then there'll be very few stories because the state of the knowledge moves very slowly. Do you think that's a fair response?
I would also argue that the stories that are written about new studies are relatively easy to write for many journalists. Covering controversies, covering many, what many studies have shown over time actually requires more specialization than most journalists actually have. And let's also be honest and say there are a lot of universities out there that are putting out press releases that are pushing, here's the latest science from Michigan State University. Notice I didn't say Rutgers. There are interests there as well who are pushing this out to the news.
Is there a middle ground between the last question and this one? Can you do a story about a particular article and particular research finding and say, this is how it fits in with the body of knowledge, and give it some more context that way? This is way outside what science is telling us, or it needs to be studied further because it's such an unusual finding. Can we have the best of both worlds?
So yes, but you would need to rely on the scientist or the team who wrote the paper to help create that context. Right. I don't think it's reasonable to expect journalists to provide that context themselves.
Yep.
Good ones do.
We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Tom Ketchkamethy at the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Bill, I want to ask you a question about the literature on persuasion. When you were talking about that, you raised the example of, I'm going to try to persuade you of something, and I'm going to tell you why I'm going to try to persuade you of this. I'm going to bring some stakes for you into that. That seems to me to be kind of halfway toward engaging the subject, your interlocutor, from a position of humility, right? Taking that a step further would be, I'm going to try to persuade you of something, and here's why I'm going to try to persuade you of this. And I'm also going to admit along the way that science has made mistakes in the past. Here are the limitations of knowledge as it stands now. Here's how we need to know more. Here's what we need to know more. My experience has been that the reason I'm asking this is because a lot of these last two sessions have pointed toward us being more onto our own games as in terms of not just being the purveyors of knowledge and the truth tellers, which has always made me very uncomfortable because we've been very good at describing the world as it is and less good at describing what's around the corner. So I'm wondering how we can approach things from a position of more humility, but specifically back to how I started all of this. What does the persuasion literature tell us, if anything, about a position of humility when engaging in conversation, and does that build credibility in the eyes of the person that you're engaged with?
So a great question, and so let me clarify. What I was trying to say earlier is that we often approach misinformation as experts by saying, "Oh, well, I know what the right answer is," and so I'm going to provide that correct information to try to correct that misinformation. That's a different situation where what you're trying to do is engage the public and try to figure out what their concerns are, where they're coming from, showing humility and saying, essentially, my job here is to be helpful to you, to hear what you have to say, to try to reflect back what science knows about this particular issue, including uncertainties, and telling you why that uncertainty matters in this particular case. So, I think humility is an important piece of this. Walking in and saying, I know all of the answers is not necessarily an approach that works with many, many people. We have to go from being pedantic to being genuinely trying to be helpful to people.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, Sunshine Menezes from Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island. This is actually kind of a related tangential question. So I've been thinking about one of Carol's recommendations, which was to use the technique of hedging in part to build trust. And so I've been ruminating on this and thinking this really does not correspond with my experience of how to build trust with people. So I do a lot of environmental science training for journalists, and many of whom are not science writers by specialty. And the last thing they want to hear is a researcher hedging about or offering caveats, as one might describe this, about their research. So I'm wondering if there is a body of literature to show the effectiveness of this, or if you can offer additional comments on whether, like how in your experience this has been especially effective.
So there's a very small body of literature to suggest that it would be helpful in building this, taking away this feeling of confusion and building trust and credibility of the scientist as well as the journalist. And it's certainly an area that is ripe for more investigation.
Anyone else? Okay, over here.
You're going to let me speak, Andy? Thanks. I'm Bruce Wilson with The Conversation. Some of you may know us, some of you may not, but the big question that we think about every day, because we work with academics to unlock their expertise, for the public good. And the big question, there was a great graph, I guess, last session about where all the publications sit in terms of left side, right side.
Oh, that was up here.
Yeah. And how do you, like most people want to read, they know where their quadrant is, and that's basically where they go for their information. So let's just say that we do have all the answers through scholarly research, to actually present an objective perspective on, especially these health issues that really are a big deal. But so let's just say we do have this body of great information that everyone in here believes the public would benefit from. But how does the whole public get access to that? Like, are we depending on Twitter and Facebook? There are people that are subscribers to countless hundreds and hundreds of media outlets, and that's where they go. So the big question is, even if we have these great answers, how do we ensure the broad public gets to that? Because we're talking about communicating science here for the public good. So I would leave it at that of what everyone thinks is, it's even if you got a piece in the New York Times, which is, huge readership, so on and so forth, but you're missing a massive number of people. So what are your all thoughts on, let's just say we do have that great article and it is done well and it is objective and it is able for people to make their own decision. How do we make sure that broad public, from underserved to overserved to diverse, right, left, everything in between?
So I'll jump in because we often try to do exactly that with something when we have what we feel is really important public health information that needs to get out to everyone. And the answer for us is to try to go everywhere. So in addition to a press release and providing interviews, and we would do that across the spectrum to anywhere. We'll use all the social media channels we have. We may film something and put that out. We may work with an outside company, a documentary maker, to tell the story about how we got to the knowledge. We may have reporters come and have some kind of special access so you can show, again, some visuals and explain why the story is so important. And then I think the issue is to sort of keep at it. So if it's something that needs to unfold over time, we might create a campaign, small p political, in including all of the audiences who need the information, bringing in all of them to hear, well, if you don't have this yet, why not? Where do we need to be that we're not? where the places where we are not there, so you're not hearing this already. So it can be an incredibly resource-intensive, time-intensive effort that you can really only do when the benefit to it is, outweighs what you're putting into it.
And Bruce, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you expose a very interesting dimension to this conversation. So without putting you on the spot, let's imagine there's some kind of fictional outlet that content is only provided by scientists and academics, just for the sake of argument. Where would it sit on that media's bias chart? Would it be smack in the middle, or would it be leaning left? And if you just follow surveys of academics, it leans left, which means hitting the right side of that chart becomes a bigger challenge than hitting the left side of the chart. You don't have to comment if you don't want to.
Well, I can comment because every day we are working tirelessly trying to ensure that the content is produced, even if it's being, yes, it is being produced probably more from scholars that lean a little bit left. But the goal isn't to get scholars going to the right to write for the readers that are going to the right. It's to get whoever the scholar is, whoever the expert is, to write it so it still can be, if it would be picked up by somebody that's more right, that is a massive success for us.
Mhm.
And so that really is the goal. It's not to do the same thing with the echo chamber. It's being able to figure out a way to make sure whatever is produced, and if you're truly a researcher who's looking to create something for the public good, you are not trying to just reach one audience. You're trying to reach a broader audience.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I think the question of like, how do you, it depends on the day, right? Some days I'm like really optimistic about this challenge, and some days I'm just like down in the dumps about the problem, because this is sort of the media structure that we have today. So as a communication scholar, I think about this. And on the one hand, if we have this hypothetically perfect piece of science information that we want to share, I think it's a collective effort, first of all, to do that. But I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about much here is that it's also on us to think about how to be more inclusive in science, more generally, right? And to think about having communities that are disenfranchised, that are underserved as parts of these conversations. And I'm certainly guilty of not doing this enough as well, but I think it really is on all of us to think about how we do that, right? I think Monica's question earlier about the World Science Federation, that's something I would love to go to, except that I don't see people like me on that stage, right? And so I think that's really important.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Joseph Fridman, and I work in a science lab at Northeastern. But I actually have a question that kind of brings a gentle but critical challenge from the humanities. And it would say that we're kind of uniquely positioned to be presentist, right? A lot of us are knowledge workers. We're well-meaning progressives, right? We get to meet in a state, most of us can afford to be in fancy places like this, in a state that's the 5th largest, economy in the world. And it means that we focus a lot on everything that we have now, and we view it as somehow discontinuous from the past. We might say that the past is kind of backwards place that doesn't have all the knowledge that we have now, and that we're really kind of at the edge of, we're pushing a bunch of different frontiers to this day. But I would say that there are actually a lot of fields that can excavate stories about how truth is made in the past. Fields like the history of science, fields like STS, fields like anthropology, that actually tell a lot of the stories that we're talking about today, stories about how different cultures do boundary making, about what's a scientific, how scientific knowledge is made, how it isn't. And so presentism makes us blind to the past, but it also makes us blind in some sense to the future. It makes us think that there won't be future folks that come along to replace all the knowledge that we're making now. That's something I worry a lot about as a scientist, actually. Like, I learned about paradigms, and then I got very, very worried that in the future there would be paradigms that replace ours today. And so I guess I wonder, we're conditioned to be presentists, but how can we both take disciplines seriously that study the past and be disciplines that could be taken seriously in the future?
I mean, in communication, we are sort of born of sociology of science and history of science, especially in science communication, right? And so I don't think we don't look back at that. It certainly does inform a lot of our work still, right? A lot of other disciplines still inform our work, and a lot of older work in the past informs our work.
I studied, my dissertation was here at UC Irvine, actually, many years ago. And one of the things I studied at that time was how do you make risks real for policymakers who have to make decisions now about risks that won't occur for a long time. So how do you reduce that discounting that happens? And I say that to say that was a long time ago, but some of the research related to that is still very relevant. We still use it. And I actually think that piece of it is a real goal of most of the communication professionals I know, which is how do you get people to take the sort of action that you want now, sometimes resisting your own human tendency to want to put things off. So I'm optimistic that we're still trying.
Okay, with that, we're going to bring this session to a close. Before I thank the panelists, I want to let you know that we're going to have lunch now in the dining room. The staff will guide you out there. We want to encourage you, as you've already started to sense, there's a very nice mix of people in this room. So use the time for networking, to meet other people, other professions. We want you back here at 2:15 to start the next panel. And with that, please join me in thanking this panel.